Hello, my friends, and welcome to Arlington Community Church. I'm bringing this message to you in a little different format because a few weeks ago, when this sermon was preached, unfortunately, our audio recording was not working. So this was back on July 6th, and it was the start of a new series that we're calling True Fiction, looking at the parables of Jesus. Because much of Jesus' teaching was in parables, especially when he was talking to the crowds of people that were surrounding him. In Matthew chapter 13, this is what we see. And so starting this series, we just want to start with an introduction of these parables and what are they for. So Matthew 13, we see large crowds of people joining around Jesus. So much so, he's on the shore and he gets into a boat, sits in a boat and begins to teach them. But it says in Matthew 13 verse 3, that he told them many things in parables. Jesus gets in the boat and starts speaking to the crowd, speaking many things in parables. He's telling them stories. Now, parables are stories that are not true. He makes them up, but they do tell truth. So there's a truth that's being conveyed, even though the story itself is not true. But this is how Jesus was speaking to the crowds. And we live in a day, and oftentimes people, will say, hey, when you're speaking or even if you're preaching, tell stories. Because stories connect with people. Stories cause people to listen differently. They engage differently. And all of that is true. But what Jesus was doing is actually quite interesting, because after he had been speaking to the crowd in parables, we see in Matthew 13 verse 10 that when Jesus got away, the disciples went to him and they asked him, "Why do you speak to the people in parables? Why are you telling them all of these stories?" And Jesus' answer is really quite shocking. Because what we find is Jesus says, I'm telling them parables in order to create confusion and distinction. Confusion and distinction. Now that seems a little bit strange, right? That Jesus would be telling these stories in order for people to clearly understand. But that's not what he was doing. In fact, this is what Jesus says, Matthew 13, verse 13. "This is why I speak to them in parables," he says, "because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." Now, I'm guessing that when the disciples heard that, they were like, "What? Like that, Jesus, we don't even understand what your parables are meaning, and now you give us an answer, and it still doesn't make sense." So they're seeing, but they're not seeing, and they're hearing, but they're not hearing, and they're not understanding. And so he goes on and he says this is the fulfillment of what Isaiah had said. And he quotes from Isaiah, which is very similar. They see, but they don't see, and they hear, but they don't understand. And now the disciples are quite confused. And so Jesus actually goes on and he explains to them what the parable meant. But there's a couple things that, just as an introduction to parables, that we want to highlight here. Two things. Number one, parables are intentionally unclear. Parables are intentionally unclear. Because an unclear story is an invitation for those who are confused to ask questions. Right? Jesus tells the story and he's creating confusion. What is he talking about? What does this mean? So let me tell you a story. This is my parable. All right? There is a man and he bought a pair of radio headphones, and he loved these headphones. He could listen to all kinds of radio DJs and some of the best radio programs from around. And he would listen to them all the time. But one thing he didn't do, because it came with big antennas, and he would never put the antennas up because it made him feel stupid. He thought, that looks dumb, having the antennas up. Plus, I can hear so many radio programs already. Why put them up? Well, one day, someone introduced him to the world's most famous radio DJ. And the man was so excited. He said, "Wow, sir, I've heard so much about you. I have read stories about your wisdom and how you run your program. I have heard other people tell me about how great you are and how you have transformed the whole radio program, the whole industry." And the man smiled and he said, "Thank you very much." But the man with the headphones said, "But there's one problem. I've never heard you myself. I've read about you, I've heard about you, but I've never heard you. I've never heard your voice myself." And the radio DJ asked, "Well, is your radio turned on?" He said, "Well, of course, yes, it's turned on." And the radio DJ said, "Well, are you tuned in to the right channel?" The man with the headphones said, "Well, yes, I'm tuned in to your channel. This is what everybody says. It's this channel." And the radio DJ said, "Well, then there's one thing that you must do. You must put up the antennas to hear me." And the man looked very sad, and he walked away because he cared more about how he looked in front of people than about hearing the voice of that DJ. Now, you can come to your conclusions on what does that parable mean? Who's the person with the headphones? Who's the world famous DJ? What do the antennas mean? You can come up with ideas, but here's a thought. Because you know that I'm a pastor and you're listening to this sermon, you can probably guess some of those answers. But what if you heard that story in a different context? What if someone at work told you that story and they weren't Christians? What if someone at a school or at the market said these things? What if someone from a government leader told you that story? You might be wondering, well, okay, who's the world famous DJ? What does this mean? You see, the confusion, the uncertainty causes people to ask questions if they are interested in knowing. Because the one who tells the parable is the only one who has the answer. Because if it's your story that you're making up, then you're the one with the answer. Jesus is telling stories. He's telling parables to create uncertainty, to create confusion, because he knows the people who want to know are going to ask more questions. Now, it wasn't only the disciples who joined around Jesus. In Mark chapter 4, verse 10, it says, when he was alone, those around him with the 12 disciples asked him about the parables. So it wasn't just the disciples. There were others from the group who also joined. Here's the question: why didn't everybody join in that conversation? Why didn't everyone come and surround him and say, please tell us, what do you mean? Because that's the point of the parable. The parable is intentionally designed to be unclear. Because those who are uncertain and who want to know more will ask follow-up questions. Which leads us to the point number 2. Parables are only made clear by Jesus. Only Jesus can make the story clear. Remember, if you're the storyteller, then you're the one who knows the answer. Only Jesus can provide answers to the parables that he tells. Matthew chapter 13, verse 16, after the disciples had asked, what does this mean? What are these parables that you're saying? Jesus says this to them, but blessed are your eyes, and blessed are your ears, for they hear. Your eyes, they're blessed because they see, and your ears are blessed because they hear and they understand. Now, Jesus is still getting ready to explain to them the parable, which is very important. Jesus tells them their eyes are blessed and their ears are blessed, not because they already understand the parable, but because they ask the question to understand. Jesus says, your eyes, your ears, your understanding is blessed, even though you don't have all the answers yet. And even though Jesus' answer to their question is still confusing, he said, you are blessed in that. You see, Jesus doesn't add his blessing to you after you finally get it. He's not saying, hey, you need to figure it out, and once you figure it out, then I'm blessing you. No, he says, I bless you in order for you to understand. Because that's the work of the gospel. That is the message of Jesus. We don't get God's favor because we've done it all right. We get God's favor so that we can do it all right. Even when we don't understand, even when we're left with questions, even before Jesus explains his answer. Blessed are you. Because Jesus alone can or makes clear the parable. So they're still confused. They're still confused. Blessed, but still confused. And so he answers their question. He answers them and tells them the parable. Again, why didn't everybody ask for clarity? Unless not everybody cared. You see, the story creates uncertainty. It creates confusion. But it also creates distinction. It distinguishes people between those who want to know more and those who just don't care. The story was not just to engage people in a different way. It wasn't just to capture their attention. I'm sure it did all of that. But the intention of it all was to actually cause people to ask more questions. And if they didn't, then they just didn't care. And Jesus knew, okay, that's where you stand. That's where you're at. And if you're not going to follow up, if you're not going to ask more questions, if you're not going to press into Jesus after he gets away from the crowd, then there's no blessing in that. There's no blessing if you're only coming close to Jesus when there's a crowd. But when he gets away and you want to know more and you press into him and say, Jesus, I don't understand. I want to know more. He says, then that's when the blessing comes and that's when the clarification comes. My brothers and sisters, there are a lot of things that are happening in our lives. And there's a lot of things that are happening in your life where God is telling your story. It's not an untrue story, but there are things that are true about you, and he's telling you these things. But it's like a parable that you just don't understand. And it leaves you a lot of times just wondering, God, what do you mean by this? God, why aren't you answering my questions? In fact, God, the answer that I get only leaves me more confused. I still don't understand. Which leaves us in one of two camps. We can either say, you know what? I don't like what's going on in my life. I don't like the story that God is saying about me. I'm walking away. And my friends, there's no blessing in that. And there's no answer in that. But if you go to him and you say, can you please help me understand? Yes, his answer may still be confusing, but a blessing is going to come with it. He's going to bless your eyes in order to see differently. He's going to bless your ears in order that you might hear with spiritual ears and see with spiritual eyes and to understand maybe what you hadn't understood before. It might take some time, but one day Jesus is going to make very clear the story that he's telling about you. It's a good story. It's a story of grace and compassion, a story of maturing and growth, and yes, discipline, because God disciplines those that he loves. Does it hurt? Does it cause us to question at times? Do we understand it all? We don't understand it all. And yes, it does hurt sometimes, but if we press into Jesus, he is going to bring clarity to it. Maybe not right away, but he will in time. So as we discover and go through these parables of Jesus, sometimes it's going to create confusion. Sometimes it might bring more questions than it does answers. But sometimes following Jesus is just like that. But we keep pressing into him. We keep going to him, even when it's just by ourselves. And we say, Jesus, help me understand. Help me understand. What do you mean by all of this? Help me understand. His blessing will come. And then the answer in his time. So keep pressing in, my brother. Keep pressing in, my sister. God is good. He's telling his story and your story.